Good morning. I'm Kathy Ozer, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Family Farm Coalition based here in Washington, D.C., and really pleased to be part of this symposium and this discussion today. Many of us in this room and people around the world or around the country who are listening in have traveled across this country and across the world around these issues, both on fighting against bad agreements, on raising these issues with our allies, and I think much of the discussion that we've heard from the first panel and the introduction to these last two panels are really bringing home an issue that's critically important when we look at both farm and food and technology issues, which is the situation that in many, many cases what's at stake in this agreement is that there are laws that have been in place within the European Union and within individual countries that truly protect their farmers, their consumers, that raise the issues, whether it's around bovine growth hormone or the beef hormone that was a major part of some of the fights in the 90s, and really puts into question what would be the outcome of this kind of agreement and the kind of downward pressure and least common denominator that we've heard being part of so much of the conversations and the discussions over the last 20 years. Within the National Family Farm Coalition have always seen a really close relationship between trade and agriculture and farm issues, but in a very different perspective than many of the other commodity groups and people who are very big advocates of free trade. Their perspective is often the myth, similar to the jobs myth, that we need increased exports to translate into a better farm economy. We would argue the opposite, that having a farm program and a federal policy that is based on exports as the solution totally ignores what needs to be the conditions within an individual country, within a community, within a region, and that in fact what's really at stake, and it's been mentioned before, is the whole food sovereignty, the whole ability to control and to influence what is available in terms of production, in terms of consumption, in terms of the rules and all of the range of issues we've discussed. So I'm really happy to moderate this session. We've got two speakers who bring a lot of years of experience around these issues. We're going to start off with Alexis Baden-Mayer, who is the political director of the Organic Consumers Association. She's been in that position since 2006, bringing her experience as an activist and a lawyer into really advocating on behalf of the over 500,000 members of the Organic Consumers Association. And we've worked with them on a range of issues, from the streets in Cancun to a lot of other more recent issues, including some of the MONSANTO actions that they planned around the country. And then the second speaker is Karen Hansen-Kuhn, who's from the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And Karen and I have worked on these issues since the NAFTA fight in early 1990s. She's bringing her experience in some of the work of IATP around some of the emerging technology issues, and really raising the awareness and the research and the documentation, similar to what's been mentioned in prior panels, of an international coordination of knowing what's been happening in other parts of the world, and then trying to raise up some of the issues that are at stake here in the U.S. So we'll start out with Alexis and then move on to Karen, and then open up for a pretty significant amount of time for questions, so be thinking about them as people are going in. We'll try to limit the acronyms, so take it up.
All right, the title of my presentation is How Monsanto is Going to Get Europeans to Eat Genetically Modified Organisms. I saw this meme on Facebook. It's been going around the last 2 weeks. Monsanto loses in Europe, hooray! You may have seen this as well. And this came from a quote. Next slide, please. Monsanto has been telling Europe will only sell biotech seeds where they enjoy broad farmer support, broad political support, and a functioning regulatory system. Next slide. And then they said, we've come to the conclusion that this has no broad acceptance at the moment. So everybody was like, okay, we've won. They're pulling out. But for the record, Monsanto posted this on their website. They say, right now the media is flooded with reports that Monsanto has stopped the marketing of GMO seeds in Germany and the EU. This is not correct. So this is what Monsanto is up against, the many local and national bans on genetically modified crops around Europe. And they definitely are working very hard to overturn these local and national bans. They might be able to do this through the European Commission. And then Plan B is to do it via the WTO. And in 2006, the U.S. won a WTO ruling that an undue delay in the EU approval process for 24 biotech crops from 1999 to 2003 constituted a de facto biotech moratorium that was inconsistent with WTO rules. The WTO also ruled that individual EU member state bans violated trade rules and were unjustified without adequate biotech risk assessments. And the U.S. is still working on this. They continue their WTO complaint to this day. Plan C is the transatlantic trade deal. And so the Hill, Congress blog, next slide, they say the Hill described, a lobbyist actually writing for the Hill, described the transatlantic trade talks as the ultimate opportunity for U.S. seed companies to change the entire process to suit their needs. And it's not just Monsanto and the other GMO seed companies that are excited about the transatlantic trade deal. Food Drink Europe, a trade association representing the biggest food companies in the world from Nestle on down, distributed a public statement on the EU-US free trade negotiations in which they said they would happily give up European laws that block products that are contaminated with what they describe as a low-level presence of genetically engineered crops that have been approved in the US but not yet in the EU, if they didn't have to deal with what they called new barriers like the US Food Safety Modernization Act. They're, you know, it's funny though, because these are supposedly countries based or companies based in a country, but obviously they're already multinational and they're using these agreements to invalidate our laws at the national and local level. So the EU has already lifted bans on imports of U.S. live swine and beef washed with lactic acid, but U.S. lawmakers want the EU to give up more of its food safety rules, including to lift GMO bans. The U.S. Trade Representative, Ron Kirk, has already made a public demand for the EU to put GMOs on the table. And then in the 2013 report on technical barriers to trade, which has been mentioned already, the USTR does list U.S. claims that the EU's biotechnology regulations have a detrimental effect on U.S. exports. And then, thanks to WikiLeaks and Food and Water Watch, we can also see how the U.S. State Department, what the U.S. State Department has been doing behind the scenes to help Monsanto and the other biotech companies. In 2010, WikiLeaks released a batch of diplomatic cables dating from 2005 to 2009. Food and Water Watch searched through them and found 926 cables from 113 countries that discussed GMOs and agricultural biotechnology. 38% of them were from embassies in U.S. member states. And so now we can read the State Department in its own words complaining about widespread consumer resistance to GMOs in Germany and absolutely no demand from consumers or producers for biotech crops in Austria, and how hard they have worked to eventually wear down Hungary's resistance, and how disappointed they were when the public showed no signs of changing their minds about the ban on biotech corn there. And the effort that they're making to limit the influence of EU negative views on biotechnology. And we also know from WikiLeaks and Food and Water Watch that Monsanto has been helping embassy and USTR officials target their diplomatic efforts by providing information on which EU countries Monsanto feels are pro-biotech, anti-biotech, and undecided. The frightening thing, as we look at what could happen in this trade deal, is that not all EU countries have been unresponsive to US overtures. Even France, the embassy in France proposed hosting a conference highlighting how biotech can address food shortages in the developing world as a tactic to counteract France's negative public opinion of GMO crops. They felt that France would be open to that. They felt that Spain would be open because they cultivate more biotech crops than any EU member state, making it worth continuing to target and encourage acceptance of GMO foods in Europe. Romania was pressed to join the EU with its biotech industry firmly secured so that it could play an active role in the EU to preserve biotech options for farmers. The State Department urged Bulgaria to become a successful model and advocate of agrobiotech within the EU. And in 2008, Bulgaria did support a European Commission proposal to approve new genetically engineered crop varieties. The Czech Republic, in 2007, the Czech Republic supported approval of 2 genetically engineered corn varieties and genetically engineered sugar beets in the EU. And we also see State Department biotech strategy cables that reiterate the effort to continue to seek full EU compliance with the 2006 WTO ruling. In France, the U.S. Embassy has supported aggressive retaliation against WTO illegal trade barriers maintained by the European Union. And finally, who would be the very best person to negotiate the U.S. position? It is Islam Siddiqui, the Chief Agricultural Negotiator for the USTR. Islam Siddiqui is currently the U.S. Trade Representative's Chief Agricultural Negotiator, but prior to that, he was the Vice President for CropLife America, the notorious lobbying group that represents pesticide and genetic engineering companies, including the Big Six, Monsanto, Syngenta, Bayer, BASF, Dow, and DuPont. Half of those companies are European companies, but they're represented by CropLife America. And CropLife is the group that infamously chided the First Lady when she planted an organic garden at the White House free of pesticides. Before working at CropLife, Islam Siddiqui was a chemical farming and biotech booster in Clinton's USDA. It was his bright idea in 1997 and 98, an idea rejected by the organic community, but the idea was to get GMOs, sewage sludge, and irradiation into the USDA rules on organic. And of course, to get his position that he currently holds at USTR, it did not hurt that he was a very big Obama fundraiser. So that's what we're up against.
All right. Well, thanks for that. I think that is a really great overview of the politics that are driving a lot of these decisions, particularly on GMOs. When I come at these issues, Kathy mentioned I've been at this for a while, a very long while, but really most of my focus over the last many years has been trying to bring developing country perspectives into discussions on trade, particularly focusing on issues of food security. When I started looking at this agreement, it wasn't so clear to me what the links were. Some colleagues said, well, maybe there'd be something about GSP preferences for developing countries and harmonizing that. But in the end, I think if we have a focus on food security or food sovereignty, what we're really talking about is how we make decisions about how our food system is governed. And I think many of us would agree that the food system we have, especially in the United States, but probably in Europe as well, is broken in many ways. It doesn't give equitable access to healthy and nutritious foods. We have bad health impacts, growing obesity, and we need to change that food system. And a big part of that will be from innovations that start first on the ground, that start in the States, that start in different places in Europe, and build their way up. And so when I look at this agreement, and when I've started to focus more on food safety issues, which frankly for me is a somewhat new topic, I look at how those decisions are made and what it will mean for the future of our food systems. So, as I said, Alexis mentioned the GMO issue, which in many ways is at the heart of the debate on this agreement. I would like to add a few other issues I think we need to be talking about. One are some emerging technologies in food in which I think the science is advancing, the ability to produce these things is advancing a whole lot faster than any knowledge about what the impacts will be on our bodies or on our environments. I'd focus especially on nanotechnology in food, but I think there are probably implications for synthetic biology as well. So these new technologies. Another are controversial food additives, things like ractopamine, another one of these mouthful kind of words like neonicotinoids, which is a food additive, an additive put in pork that is banned in many countries, including the EU, but which has already been the subject of tremendous pressure from the US on the EU to lower standards. And then finally, a new issue. In statements we've received from the EU, they've been pretty clear about wanting to open up procurement agreements at all levels in all sectors. This really raises for us a question about if this could also mean procurement commitments on issues that involve food, say farm-to-school programs. That's a question mark. We don't know yet, but I think it's an issue we need to be paying attention to. So, if we step back to think about how these standards get introduced into the trade agreements, how all of this political pressure is made concrete in the context of trade, I would look at sort of three sets of issues. At first, it would be the chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary standards. If you look at most of the bilateral agreements the U.S. is involved with, that chapter is actually relatively short, and for the most part, it points back to the WTO, which has its own chapter on those issues. And that chapter is guided by a body called Codex Alimentarius, where governments, some of which aren't in the WTO, come together to decide on food safety standards. There are 180 governments involved at this point, with 110 international NGOs following that. I think some of the issues like ractopamine, this food additive I mentioned, have been hotly debated and are sort of resolved for now. Others on issues such as bovine growth hormone have been up for debate for years, but that body has not been able to make a decision. And with issues on nanotechnology, there have been proposals from Egypt for a few years to at least put a work group together, and not even that has happened. So some of these standards sort of percolate at Codex and then make their way up to WTO, which would then feed into the trade agreements. But certainly not without the political pressure that we've heard about. I think there are other mechanisms that we could imagine could get introduced into this agreement. In the TPP talks, there's been a proposal for a rapid response mechanism that would require governments to report when they stop food at the border for food safety reasons very rapidly and to make decisions in a matter of weeks. So in some cases on issues where probably standards are in question, the competing standards. What's concerning about that proposal, besides the fact that it's such rapid pressure, is the second part of it is to make those decisions subject to binding dispute resolution. So this is a proposal that is on the table in the TPP. I think we could imagine it could become an issue in these negotiations as well, and is something we need to be focused on. And then finally, looking at how this political pressure becomes made concrete, some of the agreements will also include side letters that are in the text of the agreement. The U.S.-Peru agreement, for example, has a side letter on meat safety standards, which is about recognizing U.S. standards as equivalent to the Peruvian standards and allowing for imports of beef, which were suspended before because of concerns about mad cow disease. So I think if we're paying attention to where these issues could come out, I would say those would be the three places in the food safety standards. I've mentioned nanotech. That may be an issue people haven't even heard of. It is, I think, kind of a frightening development, and it's something that could become a huge part of our food system. The Grocery Manufacturers Association has estimated that nanotech-enabled food coatings and packaging could be 25% of the $100 million market over the next few years. It's not clear how much is already in our food system. There are nanotech-enabled sunscreens that are out there. And just to be clear, the scale we're talking about, there is still a lot of issues about definition, but for the most part, these engineered nanoparticles are between 1 and 300 nanometers. A human hair is 80,000 to 100,000 nanometers. So the extremely small size means that they operate differently than other particles. So I've listed here a few cases of products that we do know are already being commercialized. As you saw, an NGO has been testing different foods and found titanium dioxide, which I guess makes powdered donuts whiter, which makes me a little less wanting to eat those in the future. I looked at the Wilson Center's project on emerging nanotechnologies, that they have an interesting database of products being commercialized with nanotech, which include the two I've listed here, and then a comment there that most of the growth has been happening in the US and Europe. So these are both very involved actors in advancing this new technology. There is still very little information about exactly how these particles will interact with our bodies. It is pretty clear that they can pass through cell walls, that they can enter into bloodstreams. There was some research in China that indicated that nanoparticles in a study on mice could affect changes in DNA in our environment. When those particles become used, say, for pesticides or different things, it can affect the flora and fauna in the soil. This is all very tentative data that's emerging, but I think the alarming thing is the data on the impacts is coming out so much more slowly than apparently the products that are being commercialized. So we get to the way we should be handling these kinds of issues, the way we should be making decisions about what foods are safe to be in our market. Europe's we've mentioned, relies on the precautionary principle. This is something that is in the Treaty of Lisbon, in their founding document, so it permeates a lot of EU law, and it's a very basic principle that I think is unfortunate isn't in our system. It isn't totally ignored. In fact, as I was trying to find examples of where the precautionary principle is used, I was surprised to see that President Reagan approved a treaty, the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer, that included the precautionary principle. It's a principle in the Convention on Biodiversity and a founding principle in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. All treaties that the U.S. has either ratified or is deeply involved in negotiating. So this is not a foreign principle. And if I was being more optimistic, I might even think that we would end up accepting the precautionary principle here. I don't, but at least not at this point. But I think this is one of the big issues that's at stake, and I think there's also, it's important to recognize there's a huge amount of political momentum in support of that principle in the European Union. So I think this will be a big sticking point in the talks. So if we think about how we might get to different kinds of decisions about our food system, decisions that are healthier, there are different ways that can happen. FDA is the agency that makes most of those decisions. On the issue of nanotechnology, I think one hopeful sign, in the last year, they acknowledged that those particles cannot be counted as generally recognized as safe. The industry was arguing that a nanoparticle of, say, silver was the same as a macroparticle. And in fact, for many reasons, it's not. And finally, FDA has admitted that, although they're still trying to wrestle with exactly how you regulate that. I think it's an issue in Europe as well, where they have different processes underway, some of which that have been underway since 2006, to try and figure this issue out. This is the issue with the nanoparticles is both the size and the shape mean that they operate just so very differently. And again, points us back to, in a case like this, I think we can all see that it's kind of alarming to think about these things being in our food that are not visible, that are not detectable for the most part. We need to be sure that they're safe before they get in our food system. So a second category I think that would come up in the trade talks will be about food additives that for the most part are much more accepted in this country than in Europe. Bovine growth hormone is one of them. Chlorine rinses for poultry, as someone mentioned, rinsing off the stuff that's still on the chicken before it gets to the plate. This has been the subject of trade pressure. And then this chemical ractopamine, which is a failed asthma drug that is used to produce lean meat in pork for the most part. It's banned in many countries, including the European Union and China. in part because it produces so many more sick animals. So those sick animals are possibly getting into our food systems, and concerns about impacts on public health. The Danish pork industry, I think, is an interesting example in Europe of an industry that is very profit motivated, but has found ways to produce this pork without using that additive and still make a tidy profit. And as I said, it's kind of interesting that China, which is not a country we often think about for high food safety standards, has actually banned this chemical. Oh, and when we think about the recent Smithfield acquisition, in fact, all of the pork that Smithfield will be sending to China will be ractopamine free. So it is possible to do that at a reasonable price. And then I guess a last set of issues is the one that's a big question mark. This issue about whether local foods programs could be included in the procurement commitments in the trade agreement. So far, to be fair, as far as I can tell, the U.S. has not included food programs in procurement commitments. But I think it's interesting the way the EU keeps repeating over and over, all sectors, all levels, and there hasn't been any response about what's off the table. I think there is potential for this to include things like farm-to-school programs. Colleagues of mine in Minneapolis pointed out work they're doing with local hospitals to ensure that locally, which include procurement preferences for locally grown foods. These are decisions that communities are making about how their food is grown, what their food system will be, and we don't need to preempt that through a trade agreement. So for me, a happy outcome of this week of negotiations might be for the EU to say, no, we didn't mean that, and at least take that off the table. But certainly it's an issue in other sectors as well. And then finally, an issue that has started to come up in other talks as well. In a lot of ways, what's being negotiated in this agreement and in the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a kind of end run around the global rules process that we have at the WTO and in other UN frameworks. What will be developed here will undoubtedly change the standards. It will become the new normal of what's acceptable in trade commitments, so it's important that we engage in this talk just as much as the major campaigns that have been launched against some of our happy victories and some that are still ongoing. So thanks very much.
Thank you to Karen and to Alexis. And I just wanted to make one point that Karen made about when she mentioned the term of generally regarded as safe, or GRAS standards. That's kind of is an example where, as weak as our regulatory system is, it has taken positions on some really important issues. And that's actually an issue that for a product that's really of concern to dairy farmers is something called milk protein concentrate, which is used as a substitute for dairy product here in the U.S. in many processed products. And one of the concerns is that it never had a review. It never went through the GRAS standard, and it's basically coming in, being imported in processed foods. There's International Dairy Foods Association. There's a lot of different entities that are really looking out for their ability to move product globally and move products in and out of grocery stores and in and out of different chains internationally. And just as Karen mentioned, the current purchase of Smithfield by a large Chinese company, we also have supermarket chains, Giant Food, which is based around here in the Washington area, and Stop and Shop and others are owned by the Ahold Corporation, which is based in Europe. And so there's a lot of international activity already happening in the food system, and there's a real agenda to try and quote harmonize but reduce what can be moved across borders and through the distribution chain. And what's also at stake is who's actually raising and producing those products, whether it's farmers who are trying to be independent to recover their real costs of production, whether in Europe or here in the US, or farmers under what we would view as very unfair contracts by a company like Smithfield, of which there's major questions of what will happen down the road wherever they may be contracting. So these issues, we've known for a long time, but we feel it's even clearer now that food farm issues overlap into a lot of the other areas that are being discussed throughout the trade agreements. And it's up to us to start questioning those issues and making some of those connections. So we'll start out with a question from online, and then we'll go to the audience. Let's see, the first question here. GMOs should not be labeled, they should be banned. That Monsanto, with its deadly legacy on Agent Orange, let's see, PCBs, etc., is entrusted to, what is this, let's see, trade standards, to advise of trade standards is a reflection of gutless regulators, politicians, NGOs, academics. Monsanto should be prosecuted. Any comments? All right.
Well, we're working on it. It's taken the United States a long time to catch up with Europe on this, but there is very broad public support for labeling and public support for bans as well. The Proposition 37 campaign in California last year brought us very close to winning labels in California, which as 10% of the grocery market would have meant we had labels all across the country. It would have been impossible for Kraft to say, we're going to label just in California. I think the rest of us would have said, no, you're going to label everywhere. So we're fighting that again in Washington State this time. We've been very successful in fundraising for this. That also shows the public support. For California, we raised over $1 million in small contributions from our members for the Prop 37 fight, and we expect to do the same in Washington State. But it does go beyond that, and I certainly agree with the commentator that we need to ban these crops, as many states and localities in Europe have done. And we are working on that as well. You probably heard about the wheat contamination scandal in Oregon. Oregon farmers have been fighting contamination for a really long time. Oregon is the seat of our seed industry. That's where most of our vegetable seeds are produced, and it's very, very important to them to maintain their world market as a seed producer, and GMOs are very, very detrimental to that. So GMOs have largely been kept out of Oregon, and there are counties now that are working on bans. In May of 2014, there will be a vote in Jackson County. These are being done by ballot initiative. So there will be a vote in 2014 in May in Jackson County to ban GMOs in that locality, and we hope to see that spread in November and have many more counties in Oregon discussing bans. So we're working on it. We're behind Europe, and then there's something that we need to work with Europe on that they're just as in the dark as we are. They allow feed that is genetically modified to be imported into Europe at a much greater rate than they grow these GMOs, and these products are not labeled in Europe. So European consumers are probably in the dark about the animals that they're eating that were raised on GMOs, and almost all of the GMOs are being grown for animal feed. So this is the big enchilada that we both need to be working on both sides of the aisle about, or both sides of the Atlantic about. So, and both sides of the aisle would be nice. But anyway, so there's a lot of work to be done collaboratively with Europe, and I hope that this work on the transatlantic trade agreement will help spur that, because I think it's going to be a big fight when it comes to GMOs. We just saw an international protest on May 25th that the New York Times reported drew 2 million people out to. So that is very significant. GMOs are a big cause in the United States and Europe and around the world, and I think that it's a valuable issue for us to focus on when we look at the problems associated with these trade agreements.
I just want to make one brief comment about GMO wheat, and that it is not commercially approved here in the United States. That was one of the small wins in this process over the last decade between coordination between U.S. and Canada of really blocking the approval process. And it was done, even though we don't think exports are the solution to a lot of our domestic issues, done based on the argument that there would be such total rejection of products that are raised and prepared with GMO wheat. And many of us thought that that similar issue would have percolated through both the consumer side and through some of the industry around milk with bovine growth hormone. And it's only recently that bovine growth hormone has really basically been stopped being used in most of our milk production in the U.S. because so many consumers were rejecting it. And at the farmer side, there was also a lot of concern. But particularly with GMO wheat, this contamination is not only an example of, like, it puts into question our whole testing process. It puts into question the role of Monsanto and other land grant and publicly financed or actually corporate financed research and what in fact is actually happening with those test plots throughout the country. It's an issue we would hope would be raised more directly as a part of this Farm Bill discussion. Instead, what we're seeing are some very, very strong agendas by Monsanto and other biotech interests to weaken the ability of both our review process and our legal system to be able to hold back the approval or hold back the commercialization of genetically engineered products. So this issue is playing out, and it's many of the same players as Alana put up the list of, who are some of the members of the advisory committee. There's corporate interests, there's biotech interests, there's grain interests. Just on that one slide, there was Archer Daniels Midland, there were Caterpillar. They're all involved in every single sector that goes from the farm to the consumer. So some questions from the audience here.
So in food or from the prior panels, is there any indication that the USDR and the Obama administration are taking an approach different from what the multinational corporations in the United States want on this series of issues? Are there any indication that the Obama administration is going to open up these negotiations more? We're dealing with Europe. There is rule of law. There are stable governments. There's no problem with unstable governments, things like that. So is the Obama administration approaching this differently, and for us and our allies providing hope of more of an opening than what we have seen with TPP, for example?
Well, I think maybe, so the, repeating the question is, do we see any opening or change from the Obama administration and how they're going to approach these issues in light of these agreements and given some of the different conditions within the countries that are being negotiated? And it's a quick summary. And I would invite, if there are folks from the earlier panels that want to come up and join in the answers to these questions, because I think they probably cut across all of the morning's discussion. I would say so far we haven't seen that. I think Karen put out the hope that maybe through the course of this process and the opening of this negotiation this week in DC, that maybe there will be a little bit more listening on these issues. I think within the Department of Agriculture, and I can speak more specifically to USDA, we've unfortunately seen kind of a dual track for all of the years of the Obama administration of wanting to heavily promote trade and exports and pushing forward on the trade agreements, and at the same time saying we need to support local and regional food systems, we need to be knowing our farmer, knowing our food, sort of having much more of a connection with the local and regional economy. And in our view, those are really divergent tracks. And I think there's a fair amount of shifting of people in leadership within USDA, so I think some of it will maybe we'll see what happens. But certainly on the biotech side, there's been pretty strong support coming from Secretary Vilsack kind of repeatedly, and particularly when it relates to trade. The last slide that Alexis put up in terms of USTR Ag Negotiator Siddiqui's role, our coalition along with the Pesticide Action Network and the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance really helped wage the debate questioning his nomination. And it's not often that we oppose nominees to a lot of government agencies, but we did wage a pretty aggressive campaign. And Senator Wyden, to his credit, did question Siddiqui pretty extensively during his Senate Finance Committee nomination. So I think this question of where is the direction going a lot of it's going to have to come from us raising questions to our members of Congress and our members of the Senate, and for them to be raising questions very directly to the agencies and to the negotiators. And I think it's going to come from us all lifting the awareness of what's at stake in these agreements. For the Family Farm Coalition, we're an active part of La Via Campesina, which has a strong European presence, and we see a really important opening, the ability to together be exposing what needs to be done in this country to make sure that we're not, this agreement doesn't land up dismantling a lot of really important rules and laws that many people have fought for decades. But others may have other responses.
I want to add just a little bit to that. I think as regards to agriculture, different agreements have their different issues. If we think about WTO, one of the big reasons that the Doha round has not concluded has been disagreements on agriculture, on dumping and questions of subsidies that aren't really an issue here. If we look at the TPP, one of the big sticking points has been market access, or questions on dairy especially, but also with Japan coming in, rice. As other speakers have mentioned, tariffs and market access aren't so much the issue in this case. In agriculture, I haven't studied extensively, but when I looked at it just in a cursory way, it seemed like there was more complementarity. Things like, you know, European wine and cheese coming our way. And so it's not a market access question. But what is different, and what I think is really important to remember, is this agreement is about regulatory convergence. It's about setting the rules on food and other systems. So that's I think what's different about this agreement, and probably what we'll hear from the administration. It's not really about tariffs so much. It's not about market access, but it's about the rules we set on how our economies are integrated.
And just one other note on that is, unfortunately, both around this farm bill and around the budget, we're seeing a very similar agenda coming out of the Congress, trying to deregulate, to dismantle what have been really important rules that all of our constituencies have fought for. And Ginny opened up by starting with that, and I think that that is a piece of this debate that we can hopefully be clear about, that we are talking about sensible, and whether we call them safeguards or protections that have been in place and that people do not want to give up, and that we need to have people understand that it could be in a budget vote, it could be in the continuing resolution, but it also could be in these trade agreements that then play a role in forcing the hand of our own legislators to make significant changes. So when I think back on the almost more than 20 years of working on these issues, most of the major changes in U.S. domestic farm policy and our farm programs came in response to the deals that the U.S. government imposed on other countries as part of our trade agreements. So this is not a new situation of it playing back and forth. And I think what we're saying here today is what's different about this is that we're dealing with a group of countries, some of which have higher standards, and they're basically threatened by the same kind of agreements to be lowered to ours, but they'll be traded off. And unfortunately, in the past, agriculture and food-related issues have often been traded off because of this illusion that expanded exports is the solution, regardless of what the terms are. And that's a basic premise, just like the job creation premise, that we all have to work together to dispel and to talk about, what kinds of jobs, what kind of food, grown under what conditions, under what terms. And that's whether it's looking at it from, a food production or a food distribution, or many of the issues we've worked on recently of linking what are the conditions affecting farmers and farm workers or others that work in the food chain and in the food system. Other questions? Dennis?
Respond to the other question with a couple of examples that are, I think, a little different under the Obama administration, actually quite different as far as agriculture. And one is that, I'm not saying that the Obama administration is mostly captive to corporate interests. I think by and large it has been, but Secretary Vilsack did appoint this advisory committee of organic producers and conventional producers to have a dialogue on GMOs. And when when Monsanto got its secret writer put in the budget bill, he did denounce it and said that it screwed up that dialogue. So, I mean, that's not a huge victory, but it's certainly different than any other administration has gone. The other example is that the Obama administration did strengthen country of origin labeling.
Yeah.
So that was never going to happen under the other administration. Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is, you know, it's not like they're going to be our champions here, but I do think it's something we have to think about, and that, you know, it goes back to like FDR. It's like telling the progressives, we need to, that's all well and good for you guys to want us to do that, so make me do it.
Right.
And I think we have to make them do it, and I think if we do this, you know, if we have a collaboration with the European movements and so forth, we do have an opportunity to move things in a better direction.
So I'm not going to repeat all of the question or the comment, but generally that there are some good examples, particularly in the last couple of years, where the administration has taken the correct position, and in particular one has been around country of origin labeling, which was a part of the 2002 and 2008 Farm Bill that was then defunded by the appropriations process and not allowed to be implemented. It's been in place now for the last 4 years, and Canada and Mexico filed suit at the WTO against our country of origin labeling rule. And the Department of Agriculture issued on a very fast timetable a regulation modification that met the May 23rd WTO deadline, which would provide a way to make a tweak in the label that would meet, in our view, the intent of country of origin labeling. And it really did go right up against the Cattlemen's Beef Association, the meat packers, and those who exert the most control about us not wanting to know what's in our meat and what's in our hamburgers and what's in some of the issues that we would say consumers have every right to know what's in it, what country it's from, and how it's produced. And just knowing the country in and of itself doesn't always tell you that much, but if it's got a whole list of a bunch of countries, it raises some serious questions about its commingling or what kind of safety issues are at stake. So that is a really important example. So another question from the audience here?
I'm Michael Lipsky from Demos, and could you say something about the organization in the Senate of support the perspectives that have been mentioned here? I know that Senators Boxer and Sanders and Merkley have done different things over the last couple of months with regard to some of these issues, but I don't have a good sense of where the center of support would be for some of these concerns.
Well, given the legislative process that's unfolded around the Farm Bill, both on the House side and the Senate, has limited our ability to get open votes on some really important issues. And so knowing exactly where people stand on some of these issues has been similar to the trade debate in the form of dear colleague letters or in the form of members speaking up and asking questions at key, confirmation hearings or appropriations hearings. But I do think, and others may want to chime in, that there's an increasing number of senators and some members of the House, but particularly in the Senate, that are speaking out and speaking up. And we're looking at the potential of some different approaches, whether it's around appropriations, whether it's getting an oversight hearing around some really important processes that should be in place. And so some of that will unfold, I think, over the next couple months. But the debate that has ensued around both the biotech rider, which has been mentioned, and also an issue that basically gutted a really important livestock provision that we refer to as the GIPSA rider, were both provisions that got snuck into, or not so snuck into, but landed up in the continuing resolution, which is what's funding our federal government right now until October 1st. And with the new leadership of Senator Mikulski as chair of appropriations, that had been a deal that had been brokered in the end of last year under a different chairman, or Chairman Inoue from Hawaii. And when it emerged in the continuing resolution, we've tried to lift up that issue in the media, and the Baltimore Sun actually wrote a significant article and had Senator Mikulski quoted as saying that that will not be in this year's appropriations bill. And on the GIPSA rider, we've been trying to make sure that that process doesn't land up defunding when in fact we should have policy in place if those are the issues that people want to have in. But I think very similar to the trade agreement, what we've seen in our Congress is an effort to try and put in very major policy issues under the guise of, quote, saving money, when in fact it's dismantling really important provisions. And so I think the short of this is that we just all have to be very aware and realizing that that those who are trying to move certain agendas are using whatever mechanisms they can to get those into policy. And it puts a burden on all of us to be raising these issues and mobilizing where we can. So I would say that, I hope that sort of answers that question. I would say the other issue that is really important that we haven't really touched on much today is the push to reinstate fast track authority. And that's probably the biggest threat to the inclusion of a lot of the issues we've been discussing, is that if we reinstate fast track, and they're calling it TPA or Trade Promotion Authority, that undercuts the ability of our members of Congress to debate. It undercuts the ability of us as the public to know what's in a package or in an agreement. And it gets really to the initial comments that Lori made about just how much is at stake in many of the agreements we've all fought, but particularly in this agreement, in a way that things may move a lot faster based on a lot of different levels of politics. So we'll have a couple more questions, and then I think we're probably going to need to close up.
With TPA, is that invaluable? Is there any chance that the president won't get TPA?
Well, we are doing everything we can. I think as Family Farm Coalition, we're an active part of Citizens Trade Campaign. A lot of the other groups are working on it. There's been a group of freshman members of Congress that have sent a very strong letter to the administration, raising concerns about it. And I think it gets to many of the issues and many of the strategies that we've used over the last 20 years when we've tried very hard to raise serious concerns, is that it really takes away the authority of members of Congress to enact the kinds of policies that they should be in response to their constituents. Others may want to add in more, but I think it's not, clear, when the president is pushing something, and if it's seen as kind of the opening gate to a lot of these agreements, I think the outcome will be determined based on how many members of Congress, whether Democrats or Republicans, and across the broad political spectrum, raise questions about what having fast track really means to the democratic process. So I guess we're hopeful that there will be a real debate and it won't just be, rolled out. And also I know others have made this point in the past, there are many agreements that have been put in place without fast track. The issue is, will other countries be willing to give up and negotiate with the U.S. if, in fact, it's not on the table? So other questions? I have one last question here from the web. Please address the issue of wastewater and industrial plant sludges being used as compost or fertilizer on farms. No. If anyone, Friends of the Earth is here, you want to? Okay.
I'm not sure if this would come up. I don't know what Europe's.
Right.
This would be a good thing for research. I have not researched it, but if we knew where Europe stands on using sewage sludge as fertilizer, in the United States it's perfectly legal. That's how we dispose of most of our sewage sludge. It gets poured onto our farmland. And that's why one of the reasons you should buy organic, because it's not allowed in organic. And I guess I would assume that Europe has better regulations on this issue than we do. But certainly, like any of your pet food safety causes, you should definitely investigate to see where Europe stands and where the U.S. is, and whether this will allow companies to broaden their poor food safety practices in Europe, because that's the yucky one.
I just want to add a brief note on that. I'm not an expert on that, but my colleague Steve Supan wrote a report just recently on nanotech getting into our soil, and a lot of it was through residues that are in the sewage sludge that are apparently getting into the soil, and initial research on what this does to the flora and fauna in the soil. So that's on our website at iatp.org.
Okay, so for those of us here in person, I want to really thank everyone, and for those who've been tuning in online, that this, I think, was a lot of issues that we packed into a few hours, and really appreciate being here at the Sierra Club. And we've sometimes done briefings at 100-degree weather and under tents when there have been negotiations in Cancun or in other places, that I think this is really important information. It's even more critical that we do what we all can to get this information out more broadly through our networks, that we pick up the materials that are out on the table, that we use and check each other's websites, that we follow what Citizens Trade's doing, what Public Citizen, IATP, ourselves, Sierra Club. All of us are working on these issues from somewhat different emphasis and points, but realizing that when it comes to negotiations we're all being, potentially these issues will get played against each other, and we need to be aware of how these issues interconnect, and also how we need to really work hard to lift up new champions and new members of Congress, or old members of Congress getting reactivated on really being willing to stand up for the issues that we all have been standing up for decades, and that we need to make sure we don't compromise through a trade agreement for ourselves or our allies in other countries. Because I think in many cases, and I think Bill mentioned this very strongly, is that the people we work with in other countries need us to be critiquing and exposing what's going on here in our country, and for them to be hearing that there's broad opposition, both at the community level, through our media, through networks, that we are not going to just sit back and let this happen, that we're going to stand up and be organized around it. So thank you very much.